ask a question, so I'm not here presenting stuff I don't need to present. I'd like to ask a question to Truthsurge and ask him if he thinks that the burial of Jesus would be probable if Jesus was crucified. So, yeah, if you can answer that for me, then I think that would save a lot of time and useless talk.
Yeah,
Go
I
ahead.
mean, certainly, if Jesus was really a person, and if he did die on a cross and actually expire, uh, on the one hand, I would think that you know an eventual burial would work. Of course, I've heard arguments that would argue against that. That if you were crucified, the whole point of being crucified was that it was a shameful death because you're hanging nude while you're still alive in front of all your detractors. And the whole point of doing that was not to kill you, but to humiliate you, and allow you to linger for a very long time in front of people that often didn't like you. And so, you know, from what I hear, uh, that might not have included a burial because they just want you to hang for a very long time, even after you're dead. So I might dispute uh, the gospel, the way the gospels depict as the soon as Jesus dies, he's allowed. Joseph of Arimathea is allowed to get the body and put it, and take real good care of it and put it in his own tomb. I don't think that's very plausible, but I think eventually he could be buried in a tomb somewhere because I mean Jews would bury their people in tombs and put their bones in ossuaries and things like that. So it is a difficult question to answer. Uh, so it's hard for me to answer, but I would say that I believe that Paul believed that Jesus was buried. Doesn't mention a tomb though, but um, my dog may be getting up and bothering me. Uh, so yeah, I don't know what you had planned to say, but let's just let's just say that we can go on with that idea. If you want to skip that, we'll just go forward then. And I'll if it comes up later, I'll mention something.
Well, I really don't want to skip it. I mean, I'm just wondering if I have to. I mean, you basically exposed some doubt of the burial of Jesus, and something I want to point out here is that whether he was buried in a tomb or in a grave really doesn't matter when it comes to the historicity of the resurrection. But all I was going to point out is basically that one, burial of a crucified victim was Jewish custom, and we can find this, from Deuteronomy 21, 22 through 23. We can also find it in the Talmud, that it was Jewish law to bury crucified victims, and even in some legal documents of the Romans that date around the second and third centuries, it's called the Digesta. We would find that it was a custom to bury crucified victims if um, other people requested to do so. And so I think it's quite probable that since Jesus had a number of followers and these followers valued burial as an honor, I think it's pretty probable that they would request the burial of Jesus. And therefore it would be permitted, as it was in most cases during times of peace, as Craig Evans would point out. So that's basically a summary of my argument for why Jesus would be buried in a at least a grave. So, do you have any significant problems with that?
I mean, it all hinges on a long string of causality and plausibility. So I'm willing to grant certain things because in my mind today I've got some notes I want to present that I feel are going to attack the trunk of the tree rather than hundreds of branches. So I can grant that Jesus existed. I don't believe that. I can grant that if he existed, he was crucified and even buried. Perhaps they did take his body down soon because of Jewish Passover coming up, etc. So I'm fully willing to grant that, um, as long as I can make my overarching points, you know, which which I'm going to try to undermine the credibility of the very documents in which you get this information. So my approach is a little bit different. So I'll go ahead and grant it because we've spent enough time already talking about it. I'll grant it that he was buried. I mean, so you can go on with your next point, and then just do as long as you want. And then when you turn it over to me, I'll cover some basic ideas and see what happens.
Yeah, all right. Now, as most apologists would argue, they would argue that Jesus' gravesite, or if it's plausible in everyone else's mind, tomb, was discovered to be empty by, I guess, either Jesus' followers or his enemies. It was just discovered empty. It became empty for some reason. And I'm not going to argue from this solely to support the resurrection, but I think it's important to establish this fact if I'm going to put forth a case for the resurrection. And my main argument for the notion that Jesus' tomb was discovered to be empty, or at least became empty, is that the Jews of the 2nd through 5th centuries, and most likely in the first, affirmed that Jesus' tomb was stolen by Jesus' disciples. And the Toledat Yeshu is a 5th century Jewish document, but it reflects early Jewish tradition. And we even find that Justin Martyr and Tertullian, who are 2nd to 3rd century authors, affirm that the Jews had taught that Jesus' body was stolen from his gravesite. And I think this shows that it's quite probable that Jesus' body was at least found missing from his gravesite, because if the Jews were simply, it really wouldn't make any sense that they would feel a need to explain the empty gravesite or empty tomb, because they were the enemies of Christianity, and they would really just argue that, well, Jesus died and that was it. They wouldn't feel a need to move on and try to argue that his tomb was discovered empty. And the Christians wouldn't really affirm that the Jews would be trying to explain the empty tomb if they didn't, because all that would do is put more of a burden on them to disprove something that contradicted their own beliefs. So I think that's a sufficient argument to show that Jesus' gravesite was empty. What do you think about that?
I'm willing to let you talk for longer time, a little bit longer, because I really don't want to. Like I said, I don't want to address these specific points on a philosophical, at the level you're. Here's where you're coming from, and correct me if I'm wrong. You're taking the Gospels and the epistles, and hundreds of years later, other writings who are hundreds of years removed from these, and you're using those as reliable documents, and then you're trying to use rational arguments inside that framework. I don't believe these documents, the Gospels, Acts, and the epistles, I don't believe the Gospels and Acts, I don't believe they're reliable. And I want to also talk about Paul and the quality of his testimony. So I'm willing to let you talk a little longer and present as much of your case as you want, as long as I can get to what I want to say, because mine is chopping down a tree. I'm not going to talk about a grave.